I love water. I think that's why I'm in Leitrim. I love the sound of it. I love the feel of it. And the enormous amount of it that you get. There's lakes and rivers and an endless amount of them in Leitrim. Paradise is always only ever one thing. And for me, would be the shores of Lough Allen. Come to Leitrim. Could change your life.
And we have come to Leitrim. Today is a special day. We're here in the Bush Hotel in Carrick-on-Shannon, the beautiful Bush Hotel in the Michael Collins room, to launch Leitrim, the Irish Revolution, 1912 to 1923 by Patrick McGarty. Patrick McGarty, some of you know, very few people know me as Patrick McGarty. Around these parts I'm known as Pádraig McGarty, and around the rest of Ireland I'm known as Pat McGarty. But isn't that the great thing about Ireland? A number of different names meaning the same thing. I want to welcome everybody here today. We live in strange times, and because of these strange times we've had to adapt our launch here today. But so what? That's what life's all about. It's about adaptation. And it's an ill wind that doesn't blow some good, because today we're using technology. And we're using technology to reach out to an awful lot of our friends, family and loved ones here in Ireland and around the world. So what I want to do is, very briefly, I just want to maybe outline the format of this piece. There'll be an introduction by a number of honoured guests, and then what we're going to do is we're going to show you a couple of excerpts from a lecture that I gave in conjunction with the launch, but separate and very, very socially distanced, believe you me. So thanks everybody. Thanks for all your support over the years. My family are here with me today, Rosemary, Nessa and Dara, but we're missing one person in the family, that's Pádraig, and we want to wish Pádraig well, as we want to wish all our loved ones well in Ireland and around the world. So without further ado, I want to hand you over to our honoured guest to launch this book, former President of Ireland, Professor Mary McAleese. Over to you, Mary.
Well, this is my first ever virtual book launch, and it's a very special one. So good that it is a book about a county that I live right on the edge of, our little and beautiful county Leitrim, because this book focuses on the story of Leitrim during the Irish Revolution. It's a great piece of work from Dr. Pat McGarty, and also, of course, with a lot of help from Four Courts Press in bringing it to fruition. I want to congratulate both of them, but particularly Pat, because it started out as his PhD endeavour, and as a very wise man, Professor Brian McCraw once said to me, with a PhD, you don't ever finish it, you just abandon it. It's a lot of work. So a lot of work has gone into this, and congratulations to Pat for bringing it to fruition. The book, with its focus on our gorgeous county of Leitrim, it forms part of a series which, on a county-by-county basis, examines in detail the early 20th century Irish revolutionary period, that period from the first Home Rule Bill in 1912 to the end of the Civil War in 1923. Now, for all that it was small, and is small, Leitrim's story is not small. It's fascinating. It's incredibly well told by Pat, because it was an era, that particular era was an era that looked like it was starting well. The prospects were good, it seemed, for a peaceful, prosperous Ireland. Much of the land ownership had now passed into the hands of former tenants, and Home Rule had been promised and was thought to be imminent, promised by the British government. But how differently, of course, it all turned out. Within a very short time, Britain was mired in what became the Great War. Irish nationalists were facing the dilemma of their betrayal on Home Rule and, of course, partition. And the die was cast for a very troubled future, and a county, indeed a country, reshaped by those events. Many Leitrim men volunteered for service in the British Army, as indeed did people from all over Ireland. Many others emigrated when faced with the possibility that never came to pass, as it happened, of conscription. Many others, meanwhile, planned the liberation of their country from British rule. It was a very heady time, a convulsive time, and it's described in detail, giving us a really colourful and detailed kind of insight into life here in Leitrim during those times, as many strong and strident voices vied for loyalty from the men and women of Leitrim. These events at home and abroad, so they did not leave Leitrim untouched. Over 300 Leitrim men died in the trenches, but their sacrifice for Britain was eventually to be overlooked. It was doomed, in fact, in many ways to be overlooked, when eventually contrasted with the sacrifice for Ireland of those who put national and liberation, the liberation of the nation, at the top of their agenda. I think particularly of the remarkable Kilty Clogher man, Sean McDermott, who's remembered on the very street that I'm sitting on, who was a signatory, of course, of the Proclamation of 1916 and one of the leaders executed by the British. And his seminal importance to the rising was summarised by Michael Collins, who said of him, he was not Sean McDermott, he was Ireland. What a tribute. As an aside, of course, Sean McDermott knew very well the little 2 up, 2 down, rows and rows of houses in Ardoyne in Belfast, where I was born, because he lived there, and indeed he joined the IRB while living there over 40 years before I was born, into what was by then a partitioned and sectarian quagmire. Yet in his home county, as Pat's book notes, McDermott's death provoked very little apparent sympathy initially, if one were to judge by those whose voices were prominent in the press and the pulpit of the day. But this book is a warning to understand that there are other tides that are important. And as is so often the case, quietly, among the plain people of this area, a different response was galvanising, and the public mood was changing, particularly, of course, accelerated by the appalling military behaviour of the British forces and by the appalling behaviour of the Westminster government, particularly its reneging on Home Rule and its embrace of partition. It's very enlightening. It's so instructive to read in this book, which is, may I say, also very readable. It's a scholarly work, but as a scholarly work, it's very accessible, it's very readable, because although it's charting events that are a century or more old now, the truth is those events cast very long shadows so long that we are still suffering from their chilling effects. How strange it is in these COVID days, in these Brexit days in particular, to hear a British government openly admit its unscrupulous intention to break a recently agreed international treaty that would have protected Northern Ireland. Those who know Irish history can tell of the ugly long-term instability that same government's past recklessness with promises and principle provoked on our island home. In the period after the Rising, that similar recklessness, indeed some might call it ruthlessness, contributed in no small measure to the victory of Count Plunkett in 1917 and in 1918 to the sweeping victory of Sinn Féin. In this very hotel where I'm sitting now, Plunkett's victory was celebrated by no less a national leader than Arthur Griffith, who declared it the greatest victory since Clare returned Dan O'Connell. That is some accolade. How did Leitrim face into the War of Independence and the Civil War? Well, that would be to spoil the reading of this very readable book, this scholarly work. Suffice to say that Carrick and Leitrim's surrounding towns and villages were the scene of many a dramatic event. Who today could imagine that the beautiful little tranquil village of Drumsna once experienced a reign of terror at the hands of Crown forces, or that those same forces regularly rampaged through our gorgeous town of Carrick-on-Shannon? It all seems so very long ago. The detailed descriptions of those daily skirmishes, the shootings, the woundings, the deaths, the raw wounds that were left, and the descent then into a ghastly civil war after the War of Independence, they brought to my own mind not a distant past at all, not a distant even receding past, but the more recent days of the troubles that I lived through and grew up through. Because my father, who was born just out the road here on the other side of the bridge, of course, with his aunts, he sought a new future in Belfast. It wasn't the best choice that he could have made, as things turned out. And the fact that it wasn't a great choice was itself the consequence of those same atrocious politics and unhealed wounds of a century ago, left to fester from generation to generation unresolved. The good news for this generation is that Dan O'Connell's ambition for an independent Ireland of equals, where problems are solved only through democratic debate, has largely arrived and now become embedded. The Good Friday Agreement helped end the widespread culture of paramilitarism, and importantly, it legitimated both the ambition for an end to partition and the principle of parity of esteem for all Northern Ireland citizens. But a century ago, in truth, as Pat McGarty argues, no revolutionary mindset took hold in Leitrim then. Even as it confronted the Crown, old structures remained untouched, and our author concludes, rather disappointingly in some ways, that evolution rather than revolution took place across Leitrim and Ireland between 1912 and 1923. It would be some time before a vision capable of modernising and liberalising Ireland, equalising Ireland, and especially uncoupling church and state, both north and south, would emerge with the advent of free second level and the massification of third level education, liberating what Seamus Heaney memorably calls those intelligences, brightened and unmannerly as crowbars. As Leitrim sighed with relief at the end of the Civil War, but contemplated the baleful reality of two confessional states and a border on its very doorstep, in truth, another chapter, itself baleful too, was just beginning. And in this era, this time of centenaries, we hope and pray for a strong, strong culture across that border of good neighbourliness, a culture strong enough to take us safely through and beyond the consequences of Brexit and a future referendum on Irish unity under the Good Friday Agreement. The past has much to teach us, including the very less tranquil past of our lovely Leitrim. We owe a real debt of gratitude to Pat for committing to this work of scholarship. It opens a trustworthy door. There are no fake facts here. There's no skewed analysis. There are truths here. Our past is in here with all its contradictions, all its conflicts, all its heartaches. And along with Cormac O'Sullivan's earlier mighty tome on Leitrim's 20th century Republican story, there really is no excuse, little excuse indeed, for not knowing the story of one's own people and place, of not knowing what it is shaped us, made us who we are. So may the century ahead bring only peace and prosperity to lovely Leitrim, where the Shannon waters flow, to our country, to our island home. It deserves no less, and I hope that much of that will happen with the help of scholars like Pat.
Mary, thank you so much for those kind words. It means so much to me, personally and professionally. We all know you were an extraordinary president, you're an extraordinary woman, you're an extraordinary human being. And everybody knows your work in, a lot of it behind the scenes, your work in the peace process in Northern Ireland, along with your husband, Martin. And I suppose that's why in many ways when we look at the era of 1912 to 1923, it was a troubled time. It was a time where there was a lot of strife and discord, and Leitrim as a border county suffered quite a lot, like a lot of other counties across Ireland. But Leitrim as a border county, as we know, suffered quite a lot in these times. So it's so apt to have you as that bridge builder here today. And again, as I say, I'm so honoured, and thanks so much on behalf of myself, my family, and most of all, the people of Ireland. Thank you so much, Mary. Now, I want to introduce you to another Mary, another extraordinary woman, Mary Bohan. Councillor Mary Bohan is chairperson of Leitrim County Council, because an awful lot of Leitrim people who'd like to be here with us today can't be here with us today. So Mary is representing the people of Leitrim by being here with us today. And again, thank you so much. So over now to Mary Bohan.
As Cathaoirleach of Leitrim County Council, I'm deeply honoured to be associated with the launch of this book, Leitrim, the Irish Revolution 1912 to 1923. This superb book provides fascinating insights into Leitrim and its people in those dramatic years from 1912 to 1923. And it's not your ordinary history book, as it details such a comprehensive study of social, cultural, political and military developments in that period. Most of all, it dispels some myths and puts Leitrim in its rightful place in the history of the Irish Revolution. On behalf of Leitrim County Council and all of the people in Leitrim, I want to thank Padraig for the production of such a work that adds to the body of knowledge of Leitrim and its people. Thanks again, Padraig. You are a very proud Leitrim man, and we indeed are very proud of you and for all of your hard work and the work you've done on this wonderful book. Once again, thank you.
Mary, thanks so much for those kind words. So without further ado, I want to hand you over to...
My name is Joe Dolan. I'm the owner, innkeeper, and I'm very proud to be associated with the launch of Patrick McGarty's book, Leitrim, the Irish Revolution 1912 to 23. Not just because it's a wonderful publication, but because of the huge local significance and relationship with the Bush Hotel. Bush Hotel is one of the, if not, it is actually the oldest business in Leitrim, established in 1793 for weary travellers and their tired horses on the old stagecoach between the east and west coast. And appropriate that the launch was in the Bush Hotel, because there are many events reflected here in the book that actually did occur in the Bush Hotel or thereabouts. So look, I congratulate Patrick, I wish him well. I'm sure there's more to come. Thank you very much, Patrick, and congratulations again.
And now a few small excerpts from a lecture in conjunction with the launch.
As Mary McAleese says, and as Mary Bohan said about this book, that it's so readable and it's got such a scholarly work, as was said previously, is that I know Padraig as an individual, as a person and as a teacher as well, he's a giver. He's somebody who keeps connections, doesn't forget to keep in contact, and it's clear that people reciprocated that generosity he gives as a teacher and as a friend, and as a result this book is produced from it. So without any further ado, I'll give you Dr. Padraig McGarty.
So when I was researching my work very early on, I came across huge levels of state violence, disproportionate levels in Sligo and in Leitrim, and I started asking myself why. And the reason was very simple. When I started digging, I started finding that the IRA, while they weren't necessarily killing people directly, there was only 2 members of the Crown Forces killed in the War of Independence by the IRA. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But what they were doing was, they were making sure that they were frustrating Crown administration they were boycotting, they were intimidating. The police report said that McGarry's milk was refused at the local creamery, and I quote, that it was with difficulty that he obtained the services of a bull for his cows. So God help poor McGarry, and God help his cows. And our old friend boycott and intimidation appeared. And it appeared in the form of approaching people who had any plan whatsoever of thinking of joining the RIC. And a young man, Patrick McCabe, he was a railway worker in Banlamore. The word was out that he was going to go and join the RIC. He was met one night by a group of local IRA men, scuffle broke out, shotgun went off, and he lost a leg. On his way to seek compensation, a number of months later, he tried to go along and get his neighbours to take him to Carrick-on-Shannon to the Carrick Quarter sessions. Nobody brought him. So McCabe actually had to go along to the sessions on crutches, 10 miles between Banlamore and Carrick-on-Shannon. That's a long walk at the best of times. When you have one leg and two crutches, it's a long, long way. But in Leitrim, we did things differently. A wee bit differently from other counties. At Rantogue, the raiders informed the wife of the local RIC sergeant of their intention to burn the building and assisted her in moving her possessions to nearby alternative accommodation. At Fena, volunteers also moved family possessions, including turf, to the local hall before burning the building. I would have thought turf would be handy enough to burn the building with, but the lads went along and moved the turf. Because of increasing violence across the country, a group of auxiliary RIC men were recruited. They were called the Black and Tans, simply because they actually had a mixed uniform, as we all know. There was a policeman's uniform and a military uniform, hence the word the Black and Tans. They arrived into Leitrim in March, April of 1920. And when we look at Crown forces, we look at them from the point of view of the British Army, the regular British Army themselves. We look at the RIC, what we would call the old RIC, and then we come along and basically we look at the auxiliary unit and the Black and Tans. They were again helping the RIC because there was so much boycott and intimidation going on that the RIC needed help. Nobody was joining the RIC, so what did they do? They brought these guys in from England, and they were very well paid for the time. They then brought an auxiliary group in, and the auxiliary group were again different because an awful lot of people actually go along and confuse the two groups. There were two separate groups, but they're often actually called Black and Tans. They weren't. The Black and Tans were actually, they weren't paid as well as the auxiliaries. The auxiliaries were a type of crack unit who didn't take prisoners, who literally didn't take prisoners. And they hit South Leitrim very, very hard. Community halls were burned. There was two brothers, Bernard and Frank Ryan, outside Clune. When the auxiliaries arrived at their house, they erected a scaffold in their kitchen that they were threatened with hanging unless they gave information on IRA activities. And the Roscommon Herald reported that they were subjected to a half-hanging process until their faces were nearly black and their tongues lulled forth. They were then forced to stand for an hour and a half in their bare feet and half naked in icy cold water, while they were at the same time beaten with whips all over their bodies. So this is what was happening across Leitrim. At Selton Hill, outside Gorva, that most of us in this room would be familiar with, there was another ambush. And when I was a young lad growing up, my father was born and reared right beside Selton Hill. I always heard of the Selton Hill ambush. And I thought it was the IRA ambushing the British Army. But when we look at Selton Hill, it was the other way around. It was the British Army ambushing the IRA. And what they did was, as we know, they put two machine guns, two Lewis machine guns on the piers of Gate, and they opened up on the IRA unit who were based in Flint and McCulloch's, a house beside Flint's. Selton Hill. When the guys were killed at Selton Hill, their arms were captured. They had very, very little arms to work with in the first place. They had a lot less after Selton Hill. So the IRA were resigned to trenching roads, fallen trees to hamper British Army and British Army operations. So it's interesting when we look at Leitrim's history. And when we look at Leitrim's place in the Irish Revolution, we have to understand that Leitrim, like a lot of other so-called quieter counties, contributed so much to the Irish Revolution. Now it's thank you time. A lot of people I have to thank, a lot of them are named in the book, but I'm just going to run down to a couple of people very briefly. Dr. William Murphy from Dublin City University, Will, thanks so much. Will was my supervisor, my PhD supervisor, and that's where the book came out of. With the book, I want to thank Dr. Dahi O'Curran from Dublin City University as well. He's a colleague of Will's. I also want to thank Mary Ann Lyons. Mary was, again, a joint editor with Dahi. Mary is from Maynooth University. So Will, Dahi and Mary, thank you so, so much. I also want to thank everybody at Four Course Press for getting the product to market today. And it has been, you know, a tough time to get this product to market, but we've got there. So thanks everybody. Now, special word of thanks as well to the Bush Hotel here in Carrick-on-Shannon, the wonderful Bush Hotel, to Joe and Rosie Dolan and their wonderful, wonderful staff. And again, it hasn't been easy in the last couple of days, virtual launch, all the regulations we have, but as usual, the Bush Hotel, in their professional manner, they have done a super job. So guys, thank you so, so much from the bottom of my heart. My family, Rosemary, Pádraig, Dara and Nessa, thanks so much for all your support over the years. It really, really means so much to me and to our wider family circle and all friends and loved ones around the world. Thank you so much. Thank you. Finally, to yourselves, the viewers of this clip, again, many of you have come across me, and again, I want to thank you so much. If you're interested in purchasing the book, there's a number of ways you can do it. Number one is from your local bookshop. It's so important that we support local businesses in these times. You can email myself if you want for a personal a signed copy or a personal message, whatever the case may be, or also from Four Courts Press at fourcourts.ie. The details will be in the description below that you'll see in a minute. So thanks so much for watching this clip. I hope you enjoyed it. Stay safe. Slán agus Bannat.